The EU has been a leader in terms of carbon pricing, with obviously EU ETS, with CBAM coming in. I guess, how do you see this developing? How do you see the EU kind of laying out these markets going forward?
Yes, certainly. So I do think it is correct that the EU has been a leader on carbon pricing. Of course, it started off with the EU emissions trading system in 2005. It's now been running for 20 years, and it's been a key driver of decarbonisation across Europe. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is the European Commission really doubling down on carbon pricing. Because if you think about it, some of the key policy mechanisms that it's introducing are about the expansion of carbon pricing. We've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which applies carbon pricing to emissions intensive imports. We have the expansion, the EU ETS2 mechanism, as it's known, which will cover buildings and transport emissions, so covering a large chunk of currently unpriced emissions within Europe. And of course, we have the ongoing discussions around the introduction of the carbon removals and carbon farming initiative that could see price incentives extending to things like sequestration through land management techniques, but also through things like tech-based removal projects. So overall, the EU is basically taking its carbon pricing mechanism and expanding it much more broadly across the economy as a way of driving decarbonisation in a cost-effective way.
And I guess following up from that, we probably see the EU double down on carbon pricing. One of the implications we seem to see or hear about is its impact on other countries. Of if the EU is doubling down on carbon pricing, we see an expansion of ETSs globally. Obviously, like Turkey's just legislated for its own ETS. You're seeing other ETS schemes pop up around the world. I guess, how do you see the global impact of the EU's policies playing out?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of driver that's sometimes underappreciated, is how do these policy mechanisms expand over time, and what is the kind of diplomatic effort behind that? Because I think we have also seen Europe decide that it wants to play a role in pushing carbon pricing more expansively globally. And it has had an impact already on places like Turkey, as you mentioned, has now legislated its emissions trading system. But we also see other jurisdictions looking at implementing their own carbon border adjustment mechanisms, places like the UK, but it's also being discussed in places like Australia, in Canada, and Japan, and is at different levels in terms of its development in those jurisdictions. So we kind of expect that progress might be slow in expanding carbon pricing, but it's pretty consistent in seeing the growth in these mechanisms over time. And over the next 10, 20 years, it's going to be more and more a feature that industrials and different commodity traders, participants in these markets, need to take account of when it comes to their existing operations.